In the harsh winter of 1887, Eleanor Whitmore huddles alone in her crumbling cabin on the edge of Colorado Territory. Her husband died 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but a leaking roof and the cruel whispers of townspeople who think she should abandon her homestead. When 2 Apache warriors appear at her door, wounded and half frozen from a blizzard, every sensible thought tells her to turn them away. The town already suspects her of being touched in the head for staying out here alone. But Eleanor sees something in their eyes that reminds her of her own desperation. Against all reason, she opens her door to these strangers, sharing her meager fire and the last of her winter provisions. She has no idea that this simple act of mercy will change everything. But when dawn breaks and she hears the sound of 100 voices singing in a language she doesn't understand, will Eleanor discover that kindness has consequences she never imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor's fingers traced the torn edge of the property deed, the paper yellowed and frayed from countless readings. 6 months. 6 months since Thomas had drawn his last rattling breath in this very cabin, his fever finally claiming what the harsh Colorado winter couldn't touch. She folded the document carefully and tucked it back into the wooden box where she kept their most precious possession. The morning sun filtered through gaps in the cabin's cedar-shake roof, casting dancing patterns of light across puddles that had formed during last night's rain. Each drop that fell into her cooking pot below seemed to echo her dwindling hope. Thomas had promised to repair that roof come spring, but spring had arrived without him, and Eleanor lacked both the strength and knowledge to climb up there herself. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and surveyed her meager breakfast, a thin slice of salt pork and the last heel of bread she'd baked 3 days ago. The root cellar held perhaps 2 weeks' worth of preserved vegetables, and her small flock of chickens had dwindled to just 3 hens after foxes discovered the weakness in their coop. Winter was still months away, but Eleanor could feel its approach in the shortening days and the bite in the morning air. The sound of approaching hooves made her heart quicken with both hope and dread. Visitors were rare out here, 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Cedar Ridge. Most who came brought either charity wrapped in pity or demands wrapped in false concern. Through her single window, she watched Morrison's black carriage roll to a stop in her yard, pulled by 2 matched bay horses that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire homestead. James Morrison stepped down with the careful precision of a man who measured every gesture for maximum effect. His silver watch chain caught the sunlight as he straightened his expensive wool coat. "Miss Whitmore," he called through the door, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor opened the door, but didn't invite him inside. Morrison was what folks called a cattle baron, though Eleanor suspected most of his wealth came from acquiring land through methods that wouldn't bear close examination. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties and seemed to view every unclaimed acre as a personal affront. "Mr. Morris," she kept her voice level, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I trust you're managing well out here." His eyes took in the obvious signs of neglect: the sagging porch rail, the missing chinking between logs, the garden plot already surrendering to weeds. "It can't be easy, a woman alone in such a remote location." "I'm managing fine, thank you." Morrison's smile never reached his eyes. "Of course you are, but winter's coming, Mrs. Whitmore. This country doesn't forgive mistakes, especially for someone without adequate preparation." Eleanor's grip tightened on the door frame. "Is there something specific you needed?" "I've been thinking about poor Thomas's final wishes. He was a good man, but perhaps not entirely practical in his ambitions. This land," Morrison gestured broadly at the surrounding wilderness, "it's better suited for cattle than a family farm. I could offer you a fair price, enough to set you up comfortably in town, maybe even Denver." The same offer he'd made twice before, each time with increasing urgency and decreasing courtesy. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Morris." Sentiment is admirable, but it doesn't repair roofs or fill root cellars. His voice hardened slightly. I heard in town that you've been struggling, missing payments to the bank, behind on your taxes. Eleanor's cheeks burned. Small-town gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and her financial troubles weren't exactly secret. The bank president had been patient so far, but patience wore thin when winter approached, and payments remained overdue. I'll manage, she repeated, though the words felt hollow even to her. Morrison tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. Of course you will, but if you change your mind, my offer won't stand indefinitely. Land values fluctuate. After all, after his carriage disappeared down the rutted trail, Eleanor sank into the rocking chair Thomas had built for their first anniversary. She could still see him working on it by lamplight, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he carved the delicate scrollwork on the arm. The townspeople meant well with their whispered conversations and meaningful glances. They genuinely believed she'd lost her mind, staying out here alone when she could sell to Morrison and live comfortably in town. But they didn't understand what this place meant, what it represented. Thomas had died building their dream, and Eleanor would be damned if she'd let Morrison turn that dream into just another pasture for his cattle. Eleanor glanced at Thomas's old rifle mounted above the stone fireplace, its walnut stock gleaming in the lamplight. He'd taught her to shoot it during their second winter, when a mountain lion had been stalking their livestock. The weapon felt foreign in her small hands, but Thomas had been patient, guiding her aim until she could hit a tin can at 50 pace. A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself, he'd said, his calloused hands covering hers on the cold metal. But pray you never have to use it in anger. Now, watching the wall of dark clouds building over the western peaks, Eleanor wondered if she'd remembered enough of his lesson. The barometric pressure was dropping so fast, she could feel it in her bones, and the wind carried that peculiar stillness that preceded the worst storms. She stepped onto the porch, her bare arms prickling with goosebumps as the temperature plummeted. The chickens had already sought shelter, huddled together in their coop, with that instinctive wisdom animals possessed about approaching weather. Her milk cow, Bessie, stood at the far end of the pasture, lowing nervously as she faced away from the wind. The first snowflakes began falling as Eleanor hurried to secure the barn doors. They were large, heavy flakes that meant serious accumulation, not the light powder that melted by noon. She'd grown up in these mountains and knew the difference between a storm that merely inconvenienced and one that could kill. By the time she finished battening down the outbuildings, the wind had risen to a howl that made the cabin walls creak and groan. Snow was falling so thick she could barely see 10 feet in any direction. This wasn't just a storm, it was the kind of blizzard that could bury a cabin and leave no trace until spring. Eleanor pushed inside and barred the door, her heart racing from exertion and growing fear. She'd weathered plenty of storms with Thomas, but always with him beside her, his steady presence making even the worst weather seem manageable. Now, alone in the growing darkness, she felt the cabin's isolation like a weight pressing down on her chest. She added more wood to the fire, grateful for Thomas's foresight in cutting and stacking 2 cords the previous autumn. The chimney drew well, sending the smoke up and away, but she could hear the wind trying to push it back down. Outside, something crashed, probably a tree branch, though it sounded large enough to be an entire tree. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the fire. Eleanor dragged every blanket she owned into the main room and arranged them near the hearth. If the cold got much worse, she'd have to sleep right here on the floor, feeding the fire throughout the night. As if summoned by her thoughts, a tremendous gust shook the entire structure. One of the window shutters tore loose and began banging against the wall with a rhythm like gunshots. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her head and shoulders, then fought her way back outside to secure it. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow stung her face like needles, and within seconds her hands were too numb to work the leather hinges. She fumbled with the broken shutter, cursing her own weakness and the cruel timing of this storm. That's when she heard it, the sound of horses approaching through the howling wind. Eleanor froze, her hands still gripping the damaged shutter. No one traveled in weather like this unless driven by desperation. Outlaws sometimes used storms as cover, knowing that decent folks would be holed up and vulnerable. She thought again of the rifle above her fireplace and how Thomas had made her practice, loading it in the dark. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by voices calling out in a language she didn't recognize. Not English, certainly, but not Spanish either. Something else entirely, with hard consonants that cut through the wind. Eleanor abandoned the shutter and fought her way back to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the thick wood, trying to distinguish individual voices from the storm's chaos. There were at least 2 riders, maybe more, and they seemed to be circling her cabin. A heavy thud shook the door, followed by another. Someone was pounding on it with what sounded like the butt of a weapon. Eleanor backed away, her eyes fixed on the iron bar that held the door closed. In the dancing firelight, Thomas's rifle seemed to glow with golden promise. The pounding came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice calling out words she couldn't understand. But underneath the foreign syllables, she heard something that made her pause, a note of pleading, of desperate need that transcended language barriers. Someone outside her door was dying, and they were asking for help. Eleanor's eyes fell upon the hand-carved wooden cross hanging beside the doorframe, its simple lines polished smooth by years of Thomas's absent-minded touching. He'd whittled it during their first winter, when the isolation and endless snow had driven him to fidgeting with whatever wood scraps he could find. "Every home needs something sacred," he'd said, hanging it in the place of honor where it would be the first thing visitors saw. The pounding on her door grew weaker, more desperate. Eleanor pressed her palms against the rough wood and called out, "Who's there?" The response came in that same foreign tongue, but now she could hear the exhaustion beneath the words. Pain, too, the kind of breathless agony that came from serious injury. Her nursing instincts, honed through years of tending Thomas's various mishaps, overrode her fear. She lifted the heavy iron bar and cracked the door open, immediately regretting it as wind and snow blasted into her warm cabin. 2 figures collapsed forward into the doorway. Men, she realized, though they were so covered in snow and ice, she could barely make out their features. Apache, the word came to her with a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She recognized the beadwork on their clothing, the distinctive cut of their hair. The town of Cedar Ridge buzzed with nervous talk about Apache raiders, especially after the troubles down south. Most folks locked their doors and loaded their guns whenever Indians were spotted in the territory. But these weren't raiders. One was unconscious, blood seeping through the snow that caked his buckskin shirt. The other struggled to lift his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a mixture of desperation and resignation. He was young, perhaps 20, with a face that would have been handsome if not for the gash across his forehead and the blue tinge of severe cold exposure. "Please," he whispered, in accented English, the word almost lost in the wind. "My brother." Eleanor looked down at the unconscious man and saw he was older, maybe 30, with silver threads in his black braids. A dark stain was spreading across his chest, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Without medical attention, he wouldn't last the night. Every sensible thought in Eleanor's head screamed at her to close the door. These were Apache warriors, probably on the run from the cavalry. Harboring them could be seen as treason, could bring the full weight of territorial justice down on her head. The townspeople already thought she was losing her mind. This would confirm their worst suspicion. But Thomas's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows, "Every soul deserves mercy, Eleanor. Color of skin don't change the color of blood." She stepped back and opened the door wide. "Bring him inside." The conscious warrior, barely more than a boy really, struggled to drag his companion across the threshold. Eleanor helped, her small frame straining against the dead weight of the wounded man. Together they managed to get both men, Nins, and the door barred against the storm. By firelight, the extent of their injuries became clear. The older warrior had taken a bullet in the chest, probably from a cavalry rifle. The wound was partially frozen, which had slowed the bleeding but also trapped infection inside. The younger one had multiple cuts and what looked like a twisted ankle, along with the early stages of frostbite on his hands and feet. Eleanor fetched her medical supplies, the same kit she'd used to tend Thomas through various ailments: clean bandages, needle and thread, a bottle of whiskey for sterilization, and the collection of healing herbs she'd learned to identify from an old Ute woman who'd traded at the general store. "What are your names?" she asked, rolling up her sleeve. The younger warrior looked startled that she'd ask. "I am Swift Arrow. This is my brother, Running Bear." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "You help us?" While Eleanor pressed a clean cloth against Running Bear's wound, noting how his breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. "Because you're hurt and I'm here," she said simply. Swift Arrow translated this to his unconscious brother in rapid Apache, then looked back at Eleanor with something like wonder. "The soldiers, they chase us for 3 days. Running Bear, he was shot trying to protect our hunting party. We only wanted meat for the children." Eleanor worked steadily, cleaning wounds and applying the herbal poultices her Ute friend had taught her to make. The work was familiar, even comforting. For the first time in months, she felt useful, needed in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's pity or charity. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, 3 unlikely companions shared the warmth of fire and the quiet intimacy that comes from tending the wounded. Eleanor didn't know what morning would bring, but for now, mercy was enough. Eleanor spread her mother's quilt, the wedding ring pattern stitched in blues and golds, over Running Bear's still form. The quilt had been her mother's pride, worked on for 3 years during Eleanor's courtship with Tom. Each ring represented a wish for happiness, her mother had explained, and the interlocking pattern symbolized the eternal bonds of love and family. Now it covered a dying Apache warrior, and somehow that felt exactly right. Swift Arrow sat cross-legged beside his brother, chanting softly in words Eleanor didn't understand, but recognized as prayers. His earlier wariness had given way to exhausted gratitude as Eleanor worked to stabilize Running Bear's condition. The bullet had passed clean through, missing vital organs by inches, but the blood loss and exposure had pushed him to death's threshold. "He dreams of our grandmother," Swift Arrow said quietly, noting Eleanor's curious glance. "She died when the leaves turned last year. Running Bear says she calls to him from the spirit world." Eleanor dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on Running Bear's fevered brow. "What do you tell her? That his work here is not finished, that his wife carries their first child, and children need fathers to teach them the old ways." The simple humanity in those words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. These weren't the savage raiders of town gossip. They were men with families, responsibilities, dreams for the future. Running Bear's weathered hands bore the calluses of honest work, and his buckskin clothing showed the careful mending of someone who treasured his possessions. Eleanor prepared a weak broth from her dwindling supply of beef bones, adding wild onions and the bitter herbs that fought infection. The storm showed no signs of abating, and she found herself grateful for its fury. Whatever pursuit had driven these men to her door would be forced to wait until the weather cleared. "Tell me about your people," she said, offering Swift Arrow a cup of the steaming broth. He accepted it gratefully, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "We are Cherikawa. Our home is far south, in the mountains where the sky touches the earth. But the white soldiers came, said we must go to the reservation, leave the sacred places of our ancestors. And you refused?" "Some went. They live now like cattle in pens, fed by the government, forbidden to hunt, forbidden to practice the ceremonies that keep the world in balance." Swift Arrow's voice carried a bitterness that reminded Eleanor of her own defiance against Morrison's pressure to sell. Others chose to remain free, even if it means being hunted like animals. Eleanor stirred the fire, watching sparks spiral up the chimney. Freedom's worth fighting for. You understand this. That is why you help us, even though it brings danger to your house. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm's fury and Running Bear's labored breathing. Eleanor found herself studying Swift Arrow's profile, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the careful way he chose his English words. Someone had taught him well, probably a missionary or a sympathetic trader. "Where did you learn to speak English?" she asked. "My grandfather. He was guide for white trappers in his youth, before the troubles began," he said, knowing the enemy's tongue was the first step to understanding their hearts. Swift Arrow paused, considering. "But you are not our enemy, I think." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I'm not." Running Bear stirred, muttering something in Apache that made Swift Arrow lean forward anxiously. Eleanor checked his pulse, stronger now, more regular. The herbs seemed to be fighting off the infection, and the warmth was gradually returning to his extremities. "He's going to live," she said with quiet confidence. Swift Arrow's shoulders sagged with relief. He spoke rapidly to his brother in their own language, then turned back to Eleanor. "How do we repay such kindness? Among our people, a life debt is sacred. It must be honored." Eleanor smoothed the quilt over Running Bear's chest, thinking of her mother's careful stitches and the love they represented. "Just get better, both of you. That's payment enough." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor sensed that Swift Arrow's concept of debt ran deeper than simple gratitude. In his culture, apparently saving a life created obligations that couldn't be dismissed with polite protests. The storm continued to rage outside, sealing them together in the warm cocoon of the cabin. Three strangers, bound by circumstance and mercy, sharing the ancient human rituals of healing and hope. Eleanor had no idea that this night would change not just her own fate, but the destiny of two entire communities locked in a cycle of mistrust and violence. For now, it was enough to keep the fire burning and the wounded man breathing. 1 hour at a time. Eleanor woke to silence. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving behind the peculiar stillness that followed nature's violent outburst. She lay on her makeshift bed near the fire, listening to the steady breathing of her unexpected guests. Both men were alive. Running Bear's fever had broken during the night, and Swift Arrow slept deeply for the first time since their arrival. She rose quietly and peered through the window, gasping at what she saw. The world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow lay 3 feet deep across her yard, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts that reached nearly to her cabin's eave. Her barn was barely visible, just the peak of its roof emerging from a white ocean. But it wasn't the snow that made her heart race. It was the warriors. They emerged from the white landscape like spirits materializing from a dream. Dozens of them, moving in single file through the drifts with the fluid grace of men born to this harsh country. Eleanor counted 20, then 30, then lost count as more appeared from directions she hadn't thought to look. A war lance stood planted in the snow near her door, its eagle feathers fluttering in the morning breeze like a battle standard. The shaft was painted with symbols Eleanor didn't recognize, but their meaning was clear enough. This was Apache territory now, at least temporarily. At the head of the group walked a man whose bearing announced his authority as clearly as any uniform. He was perhaps 50, with silver streaking his long black hair and the kind of weathered dignity that came from leading men through impossible circumstances. War paint marked his cheeks in geometric patterns, and his buckskin shirt was decorated with beadwork that caught the early sunlight. Swift Arrow stirred at Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. He opened his eyes, saw her expression, and immediately understood. Rising carefully to avoid waking his brother, he moved to the window and looked out at the assembled warriors. "Chief Standing Thunder," he said quietly. "My uncle, He has come for us. With an army, Eleanor whispered, her mouth dry with sudden fear. With his people, Swift Arrow corrected gently. We did not return to the winter camp. He comes to learn our fate. The sound of chanting reached them through the cabin walls, deep, rhythmic voices raised in what sounded like a prayer or ceremonial song. Eleanor had never heard anything like it, the haunting melody seeming to rise from the earth itself. Swift Arrow moved toward the door, but Eleanor caught his arm. What will you tell him? The truth, that a white woman saved our lives when she had every reason to let us die. Before Eleanor could respond, he lifted the door bar and stepped outside. The chanting stopped immediately, replaced by the kind of profound silence that precedes either celebration or violence. Eleanor pressed herself against the window frame, watching as Swift Arrow approached his uncle. The two men spoke in rapid Apache, Swift Arrow gesturing toward the cabin, while Standing Thunder listened with the stillness of a man accustomed to weighing life and death decisions. Other warriors had spread out in a loose circle around the cabin, their weapons ready, but not raised. Eleanor noticed they moved with military precision, each man knowing his position without apparent communication. These weren't raiders or renegades, they were soldiers following orders from their chief. Running Bear stirred on his makeshift bed, consciousness returning slowly. Eleanor helped him sit up, noting with relief that his color had improved dramatically. The herbs and her mother's quilt had worked their healing magic. My brother, Running Bear said in halting English, looking around the cabin with confusion. Where is Swift Arrow? Outside, talking with your chief. Running Bear struggled to stand, swaying with weakness but determined to join the conversation that would determine all their fates. Eleanor steadied him, surprised by the trust implicit in his acceptance of her help. Chief, Standing Thunder, Running Bear explained. He is wise but also proud. Our people have been betrayed many times by promises from whites. He will not understand easily why you helped us. Then we'd better help him understand, Eleanor said, moving toward the door. Running Bear caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who'd been near death hours earlier. White woman, you have given us back our lives, but what happens now may cost you yours. My uncle will see your cabin, your land, and know you are alone. Some in our band believe all whites are enemies who deserve no mercy. Eleanor met his dark eyes steadily. Some whites believe the same about your people. Doesn't make either side right. Outside, the chanting began again, but different this time, questioning notes that seemed to rise and fall like a conversation. Standing Thunder raised his lance, and every warrior in the circle turned to face Eleanor's cabin. The moment of decision had arrived. Chief Standing Thunder approached Eleanor's cabin carrying a sacred medicine bundle wrapped in soft deerskin and decorated with turquoise beads. The bundle was ancient, passed down through generations of chiefs, and its presence here meant this encounter held spiritual significance beyond mere politics or warfare. Eleanor stood in her doorway, flanked by Swift Arrow and a still weak Running Bear, as the Apache chief studied her with eyes that seemed to measure not just her physical presence, but the content of her soul. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that language could build bridges or start wars. You are the white woman who saved my nephews. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. This is my home. Standing Thunder nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the cabin's obvious signs of poverty and neglect. My nephews tell me you could have let them die, that your people would have praised such a choice. My people aren't here. I am. The chief's weathered face might have shown the ghost of a smile. Swift Arrow says you asked nothing in return for your medicine, your food, your warmth. They were hurt. I helped. That's what people do for each other. That is what people should do, Standing Thunder corrected. It is not what they do. He gestured to his warriors, and Eleanor watched in amazement as they began to move with organized purpose. Some headed toward her barn and outbuildings, examining the structures with the critical eye of experienced builders. Others spread out across her property, testing the strength of fence posts and measuring the cabin's foundation. "What are they doing?" "You saved 2 lives," Standing Thunder explained. "Among the Apache, this creates a debt that must be repaid in kind. You cannot save our lives, for they are not in danger, but we can save yours." Eleanor looked around her property with sudden understanding. The leaking roof, the failing foundation, the barn that wouldn't survive another harsh winter. To Apache eyes, her homestead was as close to death as Running Bear had been. "I don't need saving. Your house says otherwise." A group of Apache women materialized from the forest, leading pack horses loaded with tools and supplies. Eleanor had been so focused on the warriors that she hadn't noticed the larger community following behind them. These women moved with the same quiet efficiency as their men, quickly establishing a work camp in her yard and beginning preparations for what was clearly intended to be a major construction project. An older Apache woman approached with a bundle of aromatic herbs. She spoke no English, but her gentle hands and knowing eyes communicated perfectly as she examined Running Bear's wound and nodded approvingly at Eleanor's treatment. She offered Eleanor a small pouch of dried plants, indicating through gestures how they should be prepared. "Grandmother Spider," Swift Arrow explained. "She is our greatest healer. She honors you for saving Running Bear with plants instead of bullets." Eleanor accepted the herbs gratefully, recognizing several varieties she'd never seen before. The exchange felt ceremonial, marking her acceptance into some invisible community of healers that transcended racial boundaries. Chief Standing Thunder walked slowly around Eleanor's cabin, running his hands along the walls and testing the strength of the corner posts. When he completed the circuit, he spoke rapidly in Apache to his gathered people. The response was immediate and dramatic. Warriors and women alike began unloading tools and materials with the coordinated efficiency of a military operation. "How many of you are there?" Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her quiet homestead into a bustling worksite. "Enough," Standing Thunder replied. "We are not many, but we are skilled. Apache hands built the first shelters in this land, long before white men came with their strange ways of joining wood." Eleanor watched a group of warriors examining her barn with professional interest, pointing out structural weaknesses and discussing repairs in rapid Apache. Others had begun clearing snow from around her cabin's foundation, revealing gaps in the chinking that she'd been too overwhelmed to notice. "This will take weeks," she protested. "You can't stay here that long. The cavalry will come looking." Standing Thunder's expression grew somber. "The cavalry always comes, but winter is upon us, and our usual hunting grounds are watched by soldiers. Your land sits between territories claimed by neither tribe nor government. It is a safe place to work, to rest, to remember what peace feels like." The sacred medicine bundle rested against a nearby tree, its turquoise beads catching the morning sunlight. Eleanor realized this wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about finding a moment of sanctuary in a world that offered precious little safety to displaced peoples. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Until the work is finished." Standing Thunder replied, "Until the debt is paid, until your house can shelter you as you sheltered our sons." Sheriff Watson's badge caught the winter sunlight as he reined in his horse at the edge of Eleanor's property, his hand resting instinctively on his revolver. Behind him rode a dozen men from Cedar Ridge, all armed and wearing the grim expressions of citizens preparing for the worst. Word had traveled fast through the small town, smoke rising from the Whitmore place. Strange singing carried on the wind, and tracks in the snow that suggested far more activity than one lonely widow could account for. "Jesus Christ," muttered Deputy Collins, the youngest of the group, as he took in the transformation of Eleanor's homestead, where once stood a failing cabin surrounded by neglect. now bustled a well-organized work camp that looked more like a military encampment than a construction site. Apache warriors moved with purposeful efficiency, some hauling logs from the forest while others worked on the cabin's roof. The sound of hammering mixed with occasional bursts of conversation in their native tongue, creating an atmosphere of industry that was both impressive and deeply unsettling to the white observers. Sheriff Watson counted at least 30 warriors in his immediate field of vision, with more moving in and out of the forest. All were armed, all looked capable, and all seemed to know exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a raiding party, it was an organized community engaged in serious work. "Should we send for the cavalry?" Collins whispered, his voice tight with nervousness. "Not yet," Watson replied, though his own unease was evident in the way he kept shifting in his saddle. "Let's see what Mrs. Whitmore has to say about this." They approached slowly, hands visible but ready to draw weapons at the first sign of hostility. The Apache warriors noted their arrival but didn't stop working, though Watson noticed several men positioning themselves strategically around the property. If this turned violent, the white men would find themselves surrounded and outgunned within seconds. Eleanor emerged from her cabin before they could call out, her appearance shocking Watson almost as much as the Apache presence. She looked healthier than she had in months, her cheeks flushed with activity and her eyes bright with purpose. More disturbing still, she seemed completely comfortable with the armed warriors working around her property. "Sheriff Watson," she called out pleasant, "what brings you all the way out here?" Watson dismounted carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Mrs. Whitmore, we received reports of unusual activity at your place. The town's concerned for your safety. As you can see, I'm perfectly safe." "Ma'am, you're surrounded by Apache warriors. That's not most folks' definition of safe." Eleanor looked around at the bustling worksite with obvious pride. "These people are rebuilding my home. I'd say that makes me safer than I've been in months." Chief Standing Thunder emerged from behind the cabin, where he'd been supervising the construction of what looked like a new foundation for Eleanor's barn. His presence was commanding enough to make several of the deputies reach for their weapons, though Watson quickly gestured for them to hold steady. "You are lawmen," Standing Thunder observed in his careful English. "You come with many guns to visit one old woman." "We come because the town's worried about Mrs. Whitmore's welfare," Watson replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "The town did not worry when her roof leaked and her barn fell down," Standing Thunder said with devastating accuracy. "The town did not worry when she had no money for food or medicine. Now, when Apache hands repair what white neighbors ignored, suddenly the town worries very much." The truth of this statement hung in the cold air like an accusation. Watson knew that Standing Thunder was right. The townspeople had gossiped about Eleanor's struggles, but done little to help beyond the occasional charity that came wrapped in pity. "That may be so," Watson admitted, "but harboring armed warriors could be seen as an act against the territorial government." "We harbor no one," Eleanor interjected firmly. "These people are my guests, working on my property with my permission. Mrs. Whitmore, with respect, you may not understand the larger implications here. There are treaties, territorial laws, military protocols." "I understand that my roof doesn't leak anymore," Eleanor shot back. "I understand that my barn won't collapse this winter. I understand that for the first time in months, I don't feel like I'm dying alone out here." Deputy Collins leaned forward in his saddle. "Ma'am, these are wild Indians. They could turn on you at any moment." The words had barely left his mouth when every Apache warrior in sight stopped working and turned to look at him. The silence that followed was profound and dangerous, broken only by Standing Thunder's quiet laughter. "Wild Indians," the chief repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, we are wild. Wild enough to honor our debts. Wild enough to help those who help us. Wild enough to work with our hands instead of just talking with our tongues." Watson realized the situation was slipping away from him. The Apache clearly weren't going anywhere. Eleanor was obviously not a hostage, and any attempt to force the issue would likely result in bloodshed that would accomplish nothing positive. The beaded necklace felt warm against Eleanor's throat, its intricate pattern of blue and white catching the firelight as she bent over the cooking pot. Grandmother Spider had presented it to her that morning, with a ceremony Eleanor didn't fully understand, but recognized as deeply significant. The old Apache woman had spoken in her native tongue while placing the necklace around Eleanor's neck, her weathered hands gentle but her eyes intense, with meaning. "She says you are now sister to our women," Swift Arrow had translated. The beads tell the story of the mountain spirit who protects all children, whether Apache or white. Now, as evening settled over the transformed homestead, Eleanor found herself cooking alongside 3 Apache women in a kitchen that had been expanded and improved beyond her wildest dreams. The Apache had not simply repaired her cabin. They had reimagined it, incorporating their own building techniques to create something stronger and more functional than what had stood before. Morning Dove, Standing Thunder's youngest wife, showed Eleanor how to prepare venison in the Apache way, seasoning it with wild herbs and wrapping it in corn husks to steam slowly in the coals. Her English was limited, but her hands spoke eloquently as she demonstrated techniques passed down through generations. "Cook slow," Morning Dove said carefully, patting Eleanor's arm with approval as she followed the instructions. "Slow cooking, strong taste. Like friendship, take time, but last long." At the expanded hearth, 2 other women worked on preparing acorn flour, a process that fascinated Eleanor with its complexity and efficiency. They ground the nuts between stones worn smooth by generations of use, then leached out the bitter tannins with repeated washings in baskets, so tightly woven they held water without leak. "We show you plants," said Blue Jay Woman, the middle-aged wife of one of Standing Thunder's war leaders. "Plants for medicine, plants for food. This land gives much, but you must know how to ask." Eleanor watched entranced as Blue Jay Woman identified dozens of plants that Eleanor had dismissed as weeds. Each had its purpose. Some for healing, others for food, still others for the practical needs of daily life. The Apache women moved through the landscape like readers in a vast library, their knowledge accumulated over centuries of careful observation. Outside, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the steady rhythm of construction work. Apache children played alongside Eleanor's chickens, their games as universal as childhood itself, despite the cultural barriers. The youngest ones spoke no English at all, but they communicated perfectly through smiles and gestures, their joy infectious enough to make Eleanor laugh for the first time since Thomas's death. "Your husband," Morning Dove said quietly, noticing Eleanor's moment of happiness. "He watches from spirit world. He is happy you smile again." The simple statement brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. These women, strangers from a completely different culture, understood her grief in ways that her own neighbors never had. They didn't offer empty platitudes or pressure her to move on. They simply acknowledged her loss and celebrated her healing. As the sun set, Standing Thunder called his people together for the evening meal. Eleanor found herself seated in a place of honor beside the chief, the beaded necklace marking her status as an adopted member of the community. The food was unlike anything she'd ever tasted, complex flavors that spoke of deep knowledge about the land's bounty. "Tomorrow," Standing Thunder announced, "we begin the ceremony of the new house. 4 days of singing, 4 days of blessing, to ensure the spirits welcome Eleanor who helps into her new home." Eleanor looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, warriors who had risked their lives to honor a debt, women who had welcomed her as a sister, children who played without regard for the color of skin or the language of their parents. These people had given her more than a rebuilt home. They had given her a place in their world. Swift Arrow, now fully recovered and serving as translator for the more complex conversations, leaned close to Eleanor. "My uncle asks if you understand what this means. The ceremony will bind you to our people in the eyes of the spirits. You will always have a place among the Apache, but you will also share our burdens." Eleanor fingered the beaded necklace, feeling its weight and warmth. She thought of her empty life before the storm, of the loneliness that had been slowly killing her, of the town's whispered concerns about her sanity. "Tell your uncle," she said clearly, "that I understand completely, and that I accept." The Apache responded with voices raised in harmony, a song that seemed to rise from the earth itself and disappear into the star-filled sky. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling truly at home for the first time since Thomas died. Morrison spread the land survey map across the polished surface of his mahogany desk, the crisp lines and government stamps representing more than mere property boundaries. They were instruments of power, tools for reshaping the territory according to his vision. The map showed every homestead, every water source, every strategic piece of land within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge, and Morrison's empire was marked in red ink that seemed to bleed across the paper. "Gentlemen," he addressed the three men seated across from him, "we have a situation that threatens not just my business interests, but the stability of this entire region." Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his black robes making him look like a carrion bird, perched on Morrison's leather chair. As the territorial judge, his word carried the weight of law, though everyone in the room knew his interpretation of justice could be bought like any other commodity. "Explain the legal ramifications as you see them," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. Morrison pointed to Eleanor's property on the map, a small square of land that seemed insignificant compared to his vast holdings, but occupied a strategically crucial position. "The Whitmore woman is harboring armed hostiles in direct violation of territorial law. Her property sits astride the main water route through this valley, and as long as she controls it, my cattle operation can't expand eastward." Colonel Hayes, the third man in the room, wore his cavalry uniform with the rigid precision of a career soldier. His presence represented federal authority, the military power that ultimately decided territorial disputes. "How many Indians are we talking about?" "My sources say at least 40 warriors, possibly more. They've established a permanent camp on her land and show no signs of leaving." "And the woman?" Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Either she's been coerced into cooperation, in which case she needs military rescue, or she's willingly collaborating with hostiles, in which case she's committed treason." Judge Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Either interpretation justifies federal intervention." "Colonel, what's your assessment?" Hayes studied the map with military precision, noting strategic positions and potential defensive advantages. "If there truly are 40 armed Apache warriors camped 15 miles from Cedar Ridge, that represents a clear and present danger to every settler in the region. We can't permit the establishment of hostile strongholds so close to civilian population." "My thoughts exactly," Morrison said, though his satisfaction was carefully concealed. "The woman's property rights become secondary to territorial security." "What do you propose?" Blackwood asked. Morrison traced a finger along the boundaries of Eleanor's homestead. "I propose that we declare the property a military necessity. The army occupies it to eliminate the Indian threat, and afterward, the land reverts to territorial control for proper development." "And Mrs. Whitmore?" "She'll be relocated to town for her own protection, of course. I'm prepared to offer her fair compensation for her sacrifice to territorial security." Hayes looked up from the map. "You're certain about the threat level?" "My men won't appreciate a long march in winter weather if this turns out to be a handful of peaceful Indians helping an old woman." Morrison opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photographs. "These were taken by my scouts yesterday. Judge for yourself." The images showed Apache warriors working on Eleanor's property, some carrying rifles, others engaged in what appeared to be fortification work. Without context, they looked exactly like preparations for a military campaign. 40 armed hostiles, Morrison repeated, building defensive positions within striking distance of our main population center. Colonel Hayes studied the photographs with growing concern. "I see warriors, weapons, and what looks like military organization. This could indeed represent a significant threat. The question, Judge Blackwood interjected, is whether we can act quickly enough to prevent a massacre. If these Indians are planning an attack on Cedar Ridge, Morrison allowed the implications to hang in the air. He'd learned long ago that men in positions of authority were most easily manipulated when they believed they were preventing disaster rather than causing it. I can have my men ready to guide your troops within hours, Morrison offered. We strike fast, eliminate the threat, and secure the area before they can organize resistance. Hayes folded the photographs and returned them to Morrison's desk. I'll need to send a dispatch to Territorial Command, but given the apparent urgency of the situation, time is critical, Morrison pressed. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to complete their fortifications and potentially attack civilian targets. Judge Blackwood stood, his decision clearly made. Colonel, I'm prepared to issue an emergency writ authorizing military action to protect territorial citizens. The threat appears immediate and substantial. Morrison rolled up the map with satisfaction, barely concealed behind his mask of civic concern. Eleanor Whitmore's stubborn refusal to sell had cost her more than she could possibly imagine. The telegraph wire hummed with urgent messages crackling between Territorial Command and distant military posts, each transmission carrying the potential to transform Eleanor's peaceful homestead into a battlefield. Swift Arrow crouched in the snow beside the wooden pole, his ear pressed against the vibrating metal as he decoded the dots and dashes with skills learned during his time as a scout for the cavalry. Many soldiers come, he reported to Standing Thunder, who waited in the shadow of Eleanor's barn. Telegraph says 40 Apache warriors threaten Cedar Ridge. Orders are to attack at dawn. Standing Thunder's weathered face remained impassive, but Eleanor could see the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Around them, Apache families continued their evening routines, children playing by firelight while women prepared the final meal in what might be their last night of peace. How many soldiers? Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 companies of cavalry, Swift Arrow replied. Maybe 60 men with rifles and a mountain howitzer. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice water. A mountain howitzer could reduce her rebuilt cabin to splinters in minutes, and 60 trained cavalry soldiers would overwhelm even Standing Thunder's skilled warriors. We must leave, Running Bear said quietly. Take our families and disappear into the mountains before the soldiers arrive, and abandon Eleanor to face their accusations alone. Standing Thunder shook his head. We came here to repay a debt of honor. We do not flee like dogs when that debt becomes costly. Eleanor looked around at the Apache camp, seeing it now through military eyes. The organized layout, the carefully positioned guards, the weapons maintained in ready condition. All of it could be interpreted as preparation for war rather than the simple precautions of a displaced people trying to survive. This is my fault, she said. Morrison must have convinced them you're planning to attack the town. Morrison? Swift Arrow's voice carried a new note of understanding. The cattleman who wants your land. He's been pressuring me to sell for months. This gives him the excuse he needs to have me declared unfit or treasonous. Standing Thunder studied Eleanor's face in the firelight, reading the guilt and determination he found there. You think to send us away to save yourself from white man's justice. I think to save your families from a massacre they don't deserve. And I think, Standing Thunder replied with quiet dignity, that running from this fight would dishonor everything we have built together. He gestured toward Eleanor's transformed homestead, the sturdy cabin with its weatherproof roof, the reinforced barn that could shelter livestock through the harshest winter, the smokehouse and root cellar that ensured food security through the lean months. More than buildings, they represented the possibility that 2 dooms could work together despite the hatred that poisoned relations elsewhere. My nephew, Standing Thunder continued, addressing Swift Arrow, ride to our scouts in the high country. Tell them to send word to all Apache bands. What happens here tomorrow will be remembered by our children's children. Eleanor realized that Standing Thunder was preparing not just for battle, but for martyrdom. If the cavalry attacked and Apache blood was spilled, defending her homestead the thaw would spread through every reservation and mountain stronghold, becoming the kind of legend that inspired future resistance. There has to be another way, Eleanor insisted, some way to avoid bloodshed. There is, said a new voice from the darkness. Sheriff Watson emerged from the tree line, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. But it requires courage from everyone involved. Standing Thunder's warriors materialized from the shadows, rifles ready, but the chief gestured for them to hold their fire. Watson continued walking slowly toward the group, his movements careful and non-threatening. I came alone, Watson said, because I need to understand what's really happening here. Before 60 cavalry troopers arrive with orders to kill every Apache they find. Eleanor stepped forward. Sheriff Watson, these people have done nothing but help me rebuild my home. They're not raiders or hostiles. They're families trying to survive the winter. Watson looked around the camp, noting the children and elderly, the domestic activities that had nothing to do with warfare. That may be true, Miss Whitmore, but Morrison's convinced, Colonel Hayes, that you're harboring an armed uprising. The military doesn't usually investigate before they shoot. Then we make them investigate. Standing Thunder said calmly. We make them see truth, instead of Morrison's lies. How? Standing Thunder walked to Eleanor's cabin and retrieved the sacred medicine bundle that had blessed their work. He held it high, its turquoise beads catching the firelight like stars. We invite them to witness our ceremony, he said. Let them see Apache people at prayer instead of at war. Dr. Harrison's black leather medical bag sat open on Eleanor's kitchen table, its brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight as he examined the array of Apache healing herbs with professional curiosity. The elderly physician had ridden out from Cedar Ridge against his better judgment, drawn by Sheriff Watson's urgent message about a medical emergency that couldn't wait for military resolution. Remarkable, he murmured, holding up a bundle of dried plants that Grandmother Spider had used to treat Eleanor's pneumonia. This appears to be a combination of willow bark, wild cherry, and something I don't recognize. The anti-inflammatory properties alone would be more effective than anything in my dispensary. Eleanor lay propped up in her bed, her breathing labored but steady as Dr. Harrison listened to her lungs with his stethoscope. The pneumonia had struck suddenly, brought on by exhaustion and the stress of watching her two worlds prepare for war. Without the Apache healer's immediate intervention, she might have died before any doctor could reach her remote homestead. How did you know to use this particular combination? Dr. Harrison asked Grandmother Spider, who sat beside the bed, monitoring Eleanor's pulse with the sure touch of someone who had been healing people for 7 decades. Swift Arrow translated the question, and Grandmother Spider replied in rapid Apache, her weathered hands never leaving Eleanor's wrist. She says the plants told her, Swift Arrow explained. Each sickness has a voice, and the healing plants sing back to quiet it. Harrison raised an eyebrow at this explanation, but he couldn't argue with the results. Eleanor's fever had broken within hours of Grandmother Spider's treatment, and her lung congestion was clearing faster than any medicine in his bag could have achieved. Whether it's the plants singing or simple pharmacology, he admitted, this treatment is superior to anything I could have provided. Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced Colonel Hayes's arrival with an advance scouting party. Through the window, Dr. Harrison could see cavalry uniforms moving through the Apache camp, soldiers examining the domestic scene with obvious confusion. This doesn't look like a war party, Colonel Hayes was saying to his sergeant as they approached the cabin. Where are the fortifications Morrison described? Eleanor struggled to sit up straighter, determined to meet this crisis on her feet, despite her illness. Dr. Harrison gently pressed her back down, his medical authority overriding her stubbornness. Miss Whitmore is in no condition to be interrogated, he announced, as Colonel Hayes entered the cabin. She's been critically ill for 3 days. Hayes removed his cavalry hat, his military bearing somewhat softened by the obvious domestic scene. The cabin showed every sign of being a sick room rather than a military headquarters, with Apache women maintaining the quiet efficiency of experienced nurses. Doctor, I was told this woman was collaborating with hostile Indians to threaten Cedar Ridge. "Colonel, the only thing threatening Miss Whitmore is pneumonia, and these hostile Indians have probably saved her life." Dr. Harrison gestured to Grandmother Spider, who continued her vigil beside Eleanor's bed. "This woman's medical knowledge exceeds my own in several important areas." Standing Thunder entered the cabin with the calm dignity of someone used to dealing with military authority. He carried no weapons, and his demeanor was that of a concerned neighbor rather than a war chief. "Your soldier, Chief," he addressed Colonel Hayes through Swift Arrow's translation. "You come to fight Apache warriors, but you find only families caring for sick women." Hayes looked around the cabin, taking in details that contradicted everything Morrison had told him. The Apache presence was obviously protective rather than threatening, and Eleanor clearly wasn't a hostess. "I was informed that you had established a military stronghold on this property," Hayes said carefully. "We established a debt of honor." Standing Thunder replied, "This woman saved Apache lives. We save her house, her health, her future. This is Apache way." Harrison closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. "Colonel, as the attending physician, I can attest that Mrs. Whitmore is here of her own free will, that she's receiving excellent care from these people, and that any attempt to move her in her current condition could prove fatal. And as a resident of Cedar Ridge for 30 years, he continued, I can tell you that Morrison's been trying to acquire this property through less than honorable means. These Apache people have done more to help our neighbor than the rest of the community combined." Colonel Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His orders were clear: eliminate the Apache threat and secure the area. But the threat appeared to be imaginary, and the Apache were obviously providing humanitarian aid rather than planning military action. "Doctor, what's your professional recommendation?" Dr. Harrison looked at Eleanor's improved condition, then at Grandmother Spider's knowing eyes. "My recommendation is that we let these healers continue their work." Eleanor's hand-painted tin cup sat beside her bed, half filled with the bitter herbal tea that Grandmother Spider insisted she drink every hour. The cup was nothing special, cheap tin decorated with faded roses that Thomas had bought at the general store during their first winter together. But it had become a symbol of the simple hospitality that bridged two worlds. Eleanor's fever spiked again as evening fell, sending her into delirium that stripped away the careful barriers between past and present. She spoke to Thomas, as if he sat beside her bed, carrying on conversations about repairs that needed making and cattle that needed tending. Sometimes she addressed her long-dead parents, asking her mother's advice about Apache healing ceremonies and whether it was proper to accept such kindness from strangers. "She walks between worlds," Grandmother Spider explained to Harrison, who maintained his vigil despite having no real treatment to offer beyond what the Apache healer had already provided: spirit fever. Her soul must choose whether to follow the path to the ancestors or return to the path of the living. Swift Arrow translated carefully, adding his own interpretation: "Among our people, such illness often comes when someone's life changes direction. Her spirit is deciding whether to embrace her new path or return to the old one." Harrison checked Eleanor's pulse again, noting its irregular rhythm and the way her breathing came in shallow gasps. In his medical experience, pneumonia patients either turned the corner within the first few days or didn't turn at all. Eleanor had reached the critical point where her body would either find the strength to fight off the infection or surrender to it. Standing Thunder sat cross-legged in the corner of the cabin, his presence a quiet anchor of strength for his worried people. Apache warriors had faced death countless times, but watching a friend fight for life in a sickbed required a different kind of courage than facing enemies in battle. "If she dies," Running Bear whispered to his brother, "the soldiers will say we killed her. They will use her death to justify hunting us all." Swift Arrow nodded grimly. The political implications of Eleanor's illness weren't lost on anyone in the room. Morrison would certainly claim that Apache mistreatment had caused her death, giving him both the legal justification to seize her land and the moral authority to demand military retaliation against Standing Thunder's back. Colonel Hayes had withdrawn his immediate attack orders, but his troops remained camped within striking distance, waiting to see how the medical crisis resolved. If Eleanor died, Hayes would have little choice but to treat the Apache as hostile forces who had taken a white woman's life through negligence or malice. Eleanor's fevered rambling grew more agitated as the night deepened. She relived arguments with Morrison, pleading with him to leave her in peace. She called out to children who existed only in her imagination, the sons and daughters she and Thomas had hoped for, but never had. Most heartbreakingly, she apologized repeatedly to Thomas for failing to maintain their homestead, for letting their dream crumble into despair. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. "I tried to keep it going, Thomas. I tried so hard, but I wasn't strong enough." Grandmother Spider leaned close, her ancient hands gentle as she smoothed Eleanor's sweat-dampened hair. The old healer spoke in Apache, her voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of a prayer or healing chant. "What is she saying?" Dr. Harrison asked. "She tells Eleanor's spirit that it has nothing to be sorry for." Swift Arrow translated, "That strength comes not from never falling, but from getting up again." That Thomas's spirit is proud of the woman Eleanor has become, not ashamed of the struggles she has faced. As if responding to the healer's words, Eleanor's breathing began to settle into a more regular pattern. Her fevered muttering quieted, and some of the tension left her rigid muscles. Dr. Harrison checked her pulse again, and found it stronger, more steady. "The crisis is passing," he announced, with relief. Grandmother Spider smiled and poured fresh tea into Eleanor's tin cup. When Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, an hour later, clear and rational for the first time in 3 days, the cup was the first thing she saw. "Am I going to live?" she asked weakly. "You are going to live," Grandmother Spider replied, in careful English, "because you have work still to do." Eleanor looked around the cabin at the faces of people who had risked everything to care for her. Apache families who could have fled to safety, a town doctor who had chosen medical duty over political convenience, even Colonel Hayes, who stood awkwardly in the doorway with obvious relief on his military features. For the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor felt not just the desire to live, but the absolute certainty that her life had purpose beyond mere survival. The new wooden door stood as a masterpiece of Apache craftsmanship, its surface carved with intricate patterns that told the story of Eleanor's transformation from isolated widow to bridge between worlds. Standing Thunder's most skilled artisan had worked on it for days, each symbol carefully chosen to represent different aspects of her journey: the mountain for strength, the river for healing, the eagle for wisdom gained through suffering. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth wood, marveling at the seamless integration of beauty and function. The door hung perfectly in its frame, sealed against winter winds yet opening effortlessly at the lightest touch. Apache engineering had combined traditional techniques with practical innovations, creating something that would last for generations. "It's magnificent," she breathed, still weak from her illness, but determined to see the completed work that had saved her homestead. The cabin itself had been transformed beyond recognition. What had been a simple frontier dwelling was now a sophisticated structure that blended Apache and white building methods. The walls were thicker, insulated with a mixture of clay and grass that would keep the interior warm through the harshest blizzards. The roof, once a source of constant worry, now shed water like a duck's back, its overlapping shingles secured with a waterproofing technique the Apache had perfected over centuries. Inside, The single room had been expanded into 3 distinct areas, a kitchen with an improved fireplace that drew smoke efficiently while radiating maximum heat, a sleeping alcove that provided privacy and warmth, and a sitting area where visitors could be entertained in comfort. Apache women had woven colorful rugs that covered the plank floors, and their pottery decorated shelves that were both functional and beautiful. The barn had been completely rebuilt using a design that impressed even Colonel Hayes, who had some experience with military engineering. The structure could house twice as many animals as the original, with storage space for feed and equipment that would last through extended periods of isolation. Most importantly, it was positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks while providing easy access during the worst weather. Eleanor walked slowly around her transformed property, accompanied by Standing Thunder and Dr. Harrison, who had insisted on monitoring her recovery. Every building showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution. But more than that, they reflected a deep understanding of what Eleanor needed to thrive in this harsh environment. "Your people have given me more than shelter," Eleanor told Standing Thunder. "You've given me hope." The Apache chief nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Apache hands build for tomorrow, not just today. Your grandchildren will live in houses we build this winter." Dr. Harrison examined the construction with professional interest. "I've never seen anything quite like this integration of building techniques. The insulation methods alone could revolutionize frontier architecture." As evening approached, the Apache community gathered for what Standing Thunder announced would be their farewell ceremony. Eleanor felt a stab of panic at the thought of being left alone again, but the chief quickly reassured her. "We do not leave forever," he explained, "but winter camps call us to the high country, and our presence here brings danger to you from white soldiers who fear what they do not understand." The ceremony began with the entire community forming a circle around Eleanor's new home, their voices raised in harmonies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Children carried torches that illuminated the carved door and the symbols that marked Eleanor as an adopted member of their extended family. Grandmother Spider approached with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, her ancient eyes bright with affection. Inside, Eleanor found a collection of seeds, corn, beans, squash, and other plants that would grow in Colorado's harsh climate. "Spring planting," Grandmother Spider said in her careful English. "Apache seeds for Apache sister." Eleanor accepted the gift with tears streaming down her cheeks. The seeds represented more than next year's garden. They were a promise that her connection to these people would continue long after they disappeared into the mountains. Running Bear and Swift Arrow presented her with a hunting bow crafted specifically for her smaller frame, along with arrows marked with the symbols of their clan. "For protection," Swift Arrow explained, "and for the meat that will fill your smokehouse." As the ceremony reached its climax, Standing Thunder called Eleanor to the center of the circle. He placed his hands on her shoulders and spoke in Apache, his words carrying the weight of formal adoption. Though Eleanor couldn't understand the language, she felt the power of being welcomed into a family that transcended blood relations. "You are no longer the white woman who lives alone," Swift Arrow translated. "You are Eleanor who helps, sister to the Apache people, keeper of the bridge between worlds." When the last song faded into the mountain silence, Eleanor stood surrounded by empty snow, but filled with the warmth of belonging. Her cabin door stood open to welcome whatever future might come. The forged legal document crackled in Morrison's hands as he spread it across Judge Blackwood's desk, the ink still smelling faintly of the chemicals used to age the paper artificially. The deed bore all the proper seals and signatures, crafted by a counterfeiter in Denver, who specialized in territorial land claims and asked no inconvenient questions about provenance. "As you can see, Your Honor," Morrison said with practiced sincerity, "my claim to the Whitmore property predates her husband's homestead filing by 6 months. This documentation was recently discovered in the territorial archives, misfiled under an incorrect surveyor's number. Judge Blackwood examined the forged deed with the cursory attention of a man whose decision had been purchased long before any evidence was presented. The document looked authentic enough to fool casual inspection, complete with water stains and edgeware that suggested decades of storage in government files. "The signatures appear to be in order," Blackwood observed, though he barely glanced at them, "and the surveyor's marks match the territorial maps." Morrison had invested considerable time and money in ensuring the forgery would withstand legal scrutiny. The counterfeiter had used period-appropriate ink and paper, copying the handwriting style of a surveyor who had died years earlier. More importantly, Morrison had already bribed the territorial clerk, who would be responsible for verifying the document's authenticity. "I regret having to press this claim while Mrs. Whitmore is recovering from illness," Morrison continued with false sympathy. "But the presence of hostile Indians on property that legally belongs to me creates an intolerable situation." Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His investigation had revealed no evidence of hostile intent among the Apache, and Harrison's testimony had established their peaceful, even beneficial presence. But Morrison's legal claim, if valid, changed the entire situation dramatically. "Colonel, what's the military's position on this development?" Judge Blackwood asked. "If Mr. Morrison can prove legal ownership of the property, then the Apache presence becomes a matter of trespass, rather than collaboration. Mrs. Whitmore would be a victim of deception rather than a willing participant." Morrison smiled with satisfaction. The legal maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity. By claiming ownership of Eleanor's land, he transformed her from a potential traitor into an unwitting pawn. The Apache became trespassers on his property, subject to immediate eviction by military force. "Your Honor," Morrison pressed his advantage, "I'm prepared to be generous in this matter. Mrs. Whitmore has obviously been manipulated by these Indians into believing she owns land that belongs to me. Rather than pursue legal action against an elderly widow, I'm willing to provide her with compensation and assistance in relocating to appropriate accommodations in town." "How generous of you," Blackwood replied dryly, though his tone suggested admiration for Morrison's cunning, rather than criticism. The meeting was interrupted by a knock at the judge's door. Sheriff Watson entered without waiting for permission, his face grim with the news he carried. "Gentlemen, I thought you should know that Mrs. Whitmore is requesting a formal hearing to challenge Mr. Morrison's claim to her property." Morrison's confidence flickered momentarily. He had expected Eleanor to be too weak from illness and too overwhelmed by legal complexity to mount effective resistance. "On what grounds?" "She says she has evidence that Morrison's deed is fraudulent. She's also requesting that Harrison and Chief Standing Thunder be permitted to testify on her behalf." Judge Blackwood frowned with genuine concern for the first time. Allowing Apache testimony in a territorial court would set a dangerous precedent, potentially opening the door for Indian land claims throughout the region. "Your Honor," Morrison said quickly, "we can't permit savage testimony to override legitimate legal documentation. It would undermine the entire foundation of territorial law." Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "What kind of evidence does Mrs. Whitmore claim to possess?" Sheriff Watson consulted his notes. "She mentions documentation left by her late husband, correspondence that allegedly reveals Morrison's previous attempts to acquire the property through irregular means." Morrison felt a chill of genuine fear. Thomas Whitmore had been a meticulous record keeper, and their past confrontations had sometimes involved written communications that Morrison now wished he could retrieve. If Eleanor had preserved Thomas's papers, they might contain evidence of Morrison's earlier schemes to intimidate homesteaders into selling below market value. "Sheriff," Morrison said carefully, "Mrs. Whitmore has been gravely ill and may be suffering from delirium or confusion. Her claims should be evaluated with appropriate skepticism." "She seemed perfectly lucid to me," Watson replied, "and determined to fight for her property rights." Judge Blackwood recognized the political implications of the situation. If Morrison's forgery was exposed in open court, it would implicate everyone who had supported his claim. But if Eleanor's evidence was suppressed or dismissed, it might provoke the kind of public outcry that could threaten all their positions. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "it appears we have a more complex situation than originally anticipated." Thomas's hidden letters lay scattered across Eleanor's kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that finally revealed Morrison's true character. She had discovered them while searching through her late husband's papers for the original homestead documentation, finding the correspondence tucked inside a leather portfolio she'd never opened since his death. The letters painted a picture of systematic intimidation and fraud that stretched back years before Eleanor and Thomas had even arrived in Colorado territory. Morrison's carefully crafted image as a successful cattle rancher crumbled under the weight of Thomas's meticulous documentation, revealing instead a pattern of theft, bribery, and violence that would shock even the corrupt officials who enabled it. "Eleanor, you need to see this, Harrison said, holding up a letter dated 3 years earlier. Thomas documented Morrison's attempts to bribe the territorial surveyor to alter property boundaries. Eleanor read over his shoulder, her hands trembling with exhaustion from her recent illness, but her mind sharp with growing understanding. Thomas had suspected Morrison's corruption long before it directly threatened their homestead, and he'd gathered evidence with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood the importance of legal documentation. Sheriff Watson examined another letter, this one bearing the official seal of the Territorial Land Office. This correspondence shows Morrison claiming ownership of the Henderson property based on a deed that the land office clerk privately admitted was questionable. Look at this notation in the margin. Payment received for expedited processing. The Henderson family had been driven off their land 2 winters ago, forced to sell to Morrison at a fraction of market value after mysterious problems with their property title. At the time, most folks had assumed it was simple legal confusion, the kind of bureaucratic tangle that plagued frontier settlements. Now Eleanor saw it as part of Morrison's systematic campaign to acquire prime land through fraudulent means. Standing Thunder entered the cabin with Swift Arrow, both men having remained nearby despite the departure of most of their band. The Apache chief had insisted on staying to witness the resolution of Eleanor's legal battle, understanding that the outcome would affect not just her future, but the possibility of peaceful coexistence between their peoples. "The talking papers tell truth about the cattleman?" Standing Thunder asked, noting the serious expressions around the table. "They tell the truth about many things," Eleanor replied, handing him a letter that Thomas had written to the territorial governor, but never sent. In it, Thomas detailed Morrison's role in stirring up anti-Indian sentiment to cover his land grabs, using fear of Apache raids to justify the federal seizure of abandoned homesteads. Swift Arrow translated the letter's contents into Apache, and Standing Thunder's weathered face grew grim with recognition. Several of the Indian raids that had terrorized the region over the past few years had occurred on properties that Morrison subsequently claimed, usually after their owners fled in fear. "Your husband was wise man," Standing Thunder said quietly. "He saw the truth behind the cattleman's lies." Dr. Harrison organized the letters chronologically, creating a timeline of Morrison's criminal activities that stretched back nearly a decade. The pattern was unmistakable: identify valuable property, create legal confusion or physical threats to force the owners to sell, then use corrupted officials to legitimize the theft. "This is enough evidence to hang Morrison," Sheriff Watson declared, "if we can get it before an honest judge." "Judge Blackwood isn't honest," Eleanor pointed out. "Morrison owns him as surely as he owns his cattle. Then we go over Blackwood's head." Dr. Harrison suggested, "The territorial capital has federal judges who aren't beholden to local interests." Eleanor picked up the last letter in the collection, one that Thomas had written to her, but never delivered. In it, he expressed his fears about Morrison's growing power and his determination to protect their homestead at any cost. "My dearest Eleanor," she read aloud, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "If you are reading this, then Morrison's schemes have likely succeeded in ways I hope to prevent. But know that the truth has power beyond any man's corruption, and justice may come slowly but comes surely to those who refuse to surrender. The letter continued with specific instructions about where Thomas had hidden additional evidence: photographs of Morrison's forged documents, copies of bribed officials' correspondence, and testimony from other victims who had been too frightened to speak out publicly. Thomas built a case that could destroy Morrison completely. Eleanor realized, not just the land fraud, but everything: the bribes, the intimidation, the false Indian raids he arranged to cover his crimes. Standing Thunder studied the scattered letters with the strategic mind of a war chief, evaluating enemy positions. These talking papers are powerful weapons, but weapons only win battles when used by warriors brave enough to fight. Eleanor looked around the table at the unlikely alliance that had formed to protect her homestead. A town doctor who risked his reputation by supporting Apache healing, a sheriff who chose justice over political expediency, and Apache leaders who stayed to defend a white woman despite the danger to their own people. "Then it's time to go to war," she said quietly, gathering Thomas's letters with hands that no longer trembled. The new community charter lay spread across the table in Cedar Ridge's town hall. Its fresh ink still drying as representatives from both the Apache band and the territorial government signed their names to a document that would reshape relations throughout the Colorado frontier. Eleanor watched with wonder as enemies became allies, their signatures marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Morrison sat in shackles at the defendant's table, his empire reduced to ruins by Thomas's carefully preserved evidence. The federal marshals had arrested him at dawn, charging him with fraud, bribery, and conspiracy in a case that had sent shockwaves through the territorial capital. Judge Blackwood sat beside him in identical restraints, his judicial robes replaced by prisoner's clothes that marked his fall from power. "The evidence is overwhelming," announced Federal Judge Matthews, who had traveled from Denver to oversee the extraordinary proceedings. "Mr. Morrison's systematic fraud has affected dozens of property owners throughout the territory, while Judge Blackwood's corruption has undermined the integrity of territorial law itself." Colonel Hayes stood to address the court, his military bearing reflecting the official change in federal policy that the revelations had prompted. "The Army's investigation has confirmed that several alleged Indian raids were orchestrated by Morrison's men to drive legitimate property owners from their land. We extend formal apologies to Chief Standing Thunder and his people for military actions based on false intelligence." Standing Thunder rose with dignity, accepting the apology with a grace that impressed everyone present. "The Apache people do not seek revenge, only the chance to live in peace with our white neighbors. This charter makes such peace possible for the first time." The community charter represented months of negotiation between tribal leaders, territorial officials, and local citizens. It established formal protocols for trade, mutual assistance during emergencies, and the sharing of medical knowledge that had proven so valuable during Eleanor's illness. Most importantly, it recognized the Apache as permanent residents of the region, with rights and responsibilities equal to those of white settlers. Dr. Harrison signed as the medical representative, his endorsement carrying special weight after his public testimony about Apache healing techniques. "This agreement will allow us to combine the best of both medical traditions," he explained to the assembled crowd. "The Apache have knowledge about local plants and treatments that could benefit every family in the territory." Sheriff Watson added his signature as the law enforcement representative, symbolizing the end of the period when Apache presence was automatically seen as criminal activity. "This charter gives us a framework for resolving disputes peacefully," he said. "No more assumption that every problem requires military force." Eleanor stepped forward to sign as the civilian witness, her name representing the bridge of trust that had made the entire agreement possible. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she wrote Eleanor Whitmore in careful script, knowing that her signature marked not just the end of her legal battles, but the beginning of a new role as a permanent liaison between communities. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Matthews addressed her directly, Your actions in sheltering Apache warriors and your husband's documentation of Morrison's crimes have made this resolution possible. The territorial government is prepared to compensate you for your suffering and recognize your property rights in perpetuity." Eleanor shook her head politely. "Your Honor, I don't want compensation. I want assurance that what happened to me won't happen to other families, Apache or white." The crowd murmured with approval, recognizing the justice in Eleanor's request. Morrison's crimes had affected far more people than just her, and many families were still struggling with the aftermath of his fraudulent land grabs. "The court will ensure that all of Morrison's ill-gotten gains are distributed among his victims," Judge Matthews promised. "His cattle operation will be dissolved and the land returned to its rightful owners." Standing Thunder approached Eleanor as the formal proceedings concluded, carrying a document written in both Apache symbols and English. "The tribal council has voted," he announced. "You are now officially recognized as an Apache peace chief, with authority to speak for our people in negotiations with white officials." Eleanor accepted the honor with tears in her eyes, understanding that it represented far more than a ceremonial title. She would become the permanent bridge between worlds, helping both communities navigate the complex process of building genuine partnership. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, Eleanor stood on the steps of the town hall surrounded by Apache families and white settlers who were learning to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. Morrison's empire of fear and fraud was finished, replaced by something unprecedented in the frontier experience, a community built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. The charter would be tested by future conflicts and misunderstandings, but Eleanor felt confident that the foundation they had built together was strong enough to weather any storm. She fingered the beaded necklace that marked her adoption into the Apache community, knowing that some bridges once built with courage and maintained with love could span any divide. The shared garden bloomed with an abundance that surprised even Eleanor, who had spent decades coaxing life from Colorado's stubborn soil. Apache corn grew tall beside her own varieties, their different genetics creating hybrids that seemed more resilient than either parent strain. Squash vines wound between neat rows of beans, while traditional herbs from both cultures created a living pharmacy that served families from miles around. Eleanor knelt beside a patch of medicinal plants, her weathered hands as gentle with the seedlings as Grandmother Spider had taught her. The old Apache healer visited regularly now, traveling the established trail between the mountain camps and Eleanor's homestead with the authority of someone whose wisdom transcended tribal boundaries. "The roots know no difference between Apache soil and white soil," Grandmother Spider observed, settling beside Eleanor with the careful movements of advanced advice. "Good earth makes good medicine for all people." Spring had brought changes beyond the garden's remarkable productivity. The trail to Eleanor's homestead had become a regular thoroughfare for trade between the Apache communities and Cedar Ridge. Pack trains carried goods in both directions, Apache crafts and medicinal herbs traveling to town markets, while manufactured goods and supplies moved toward the mountain settlements. Eleanor had become the unofficial coordinator of this commerce, her rebuilt cabin serving as a neutral meeting ground where business could be conducted without the suspicions that still plagued direct contact between the communities. Her kitchen table, once the site of lonely meals, now hosted negotiations that affected the prosperity of both peoples. Mrs. Eleanor called Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman whose family had recently settled in the valley. "The Apache blankets sold well in Santa Fe. The traders want to know if we can provide 50 more by autumn." Eleanor consulted the ledger book where she tracked the growing network of trade relationships. Apache women had proven skilled at producing goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets, while the income from sales allowed them to purchase tools and supplies that made life in the mountains more sustainable. "Tell them we can manage 30 blankets by autumn," Eleanor replied after checking her records. but only if we can get more wool from the Henderson ranch. The Henderson family had returned to their original homestead after Morrison's arrest, their land restored through the federal investigation of his crimes. Like many of Morrison's victims, they had emerged from the ordeal with a new appreciation for neighbors who had supported them during their darkest hours. Harrison arrived for his weekly medical consultation, a routine that had evolved from Eleanor's recovery into a regular exchange of healing knowledge. His collaboration with Apache healers had revolutionized medical care throughout the territory, combining traditional European techniques with indigenous plant medicine to create treatments more effective than either approach alone. "How is the new clinic progressing?" Eleanor asked as he examined a selection of dried herbs that Grandmother Spider had prepared. "Construction should finish by midsummer," Harrison replied with satisfaction. "We'll be the first medical facility in the territory designed from the beginning to integrate both healing traditions." The clinic represented another breakthrough in the gradual integration of the two communities. Young Apache men were training as interpreters and medical assistants, while white apprentices learned to identify and prepare traditional plant medicine. The knowledge exchange benefited everyone, creating a medical system uniquely adapted to frontier conditions. Eleanor walked through her transformed property as evening approached, noting how the boundaries between Apache and white architecture had blurred in the ongoing improvements. Her cabin now incorporated design elements from both traditions, creating a style that was purely functional yet beautiful in its harmony with the surrounding landscape. Standing Thunder emerged from the forest with a small group of young warriors, their monthly visit timed to coincide with the full moon and the tribal council meetings that addressed regional concerns. Eleanor had become an unofficial member of that council, her voice carrying weight in decisions that affected relationships with territorial authorities. "Eleanor, who helps?" Standing Thunder greeted her with the formal title that had become her name among the Apache people. "The young men wish to thank you for arranging their work with the railroad survey crew." Eleanor smiled at the group of warriors who had traded their traditional weapons for surveying tools, earning wages that supported their families while learning skills that would serve their communities for generations. The railroad would eventually cross Apache lands, but now it would do so as partners rather than invaders. As night settled over the valley, Eleanor sat on her porch, watching fireflies dance among the garden plants that represented the marriage of two agricultural traditions. Her tin cup held tea brewed from Apache herbs, sweetened with honey from hives that European bees had established in Apache territory. The loneliness that had nearly killed her seemed like a memory from someone else's life. Her homestead had become the heart of something unprecedented, a community where different peoples had learned to see their diversity as strength rather than threat. Thomas would have been proud, Eleanor thought, of how their simple dream of building a life in the wilderness had grown into something that would outlast them both. The shared garden bloomed with an abundance that surprised even Eleanor, who had spent decades coaxing life from Colorado's stubborn soil. Apache corn grew tall beside her own varieties, their different genetics creating hybrids that seemed more resilient than either parent strain. Squash vines wound between neat rows of beans, while traditional herbs from both cultures created a living pharmacy that served families from miles around. Eleanor knelt beside a patch of medicinal plants, her weathered hands as gentle with the seedlings as Grandmother Spider had taught her. The old Apache healer visited regularly now, traveling the established trail between the mountain camps and Eleanor's homestead with the authority of someone whose wisdom transcended tribal boundaries. "The roots know no difference between Apache soil and white soil," Grandmother Spider observed, settling beside Eleanor with the careful movements of advanced age. "Good earth makes good medicine for all people." Spring had brought changes beyond the garden's remarkable productivity. The trail to Eleanor's homestead had become a regular thoroughfare for trade between the Apache communities and Cedar Ridge. Pack trains carried goods in both directions, Apache crafts and medicinal herbs, traveling to town markets while manufactured goods and supplies moved toward the mountain settlement. Eleanor had become the unofficial coordinator of this commerce. her rebuilt cabin serving as a neutral meeting ground where business could be conducted without the suspicions that still plagued direct contact between the community. Her kitchen table, once the site of lonely meals, now hosted negotiations that affected the prosperity of both peoples. Mrs. Eleanor, called Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman whose family had recently settled in the valley, the Apache blankets sold well in Santa Fe. The traders want to know if we can provide 50 more by autumn. Eleanor consulted the ledger book where she tracked the growing network of trade relationships. Apache women had proven skilled at producing goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets, while the income from sales allowed them to purchase tools and supplies that made life in the mountains more sustainable. "Tell them we can manage 30 blankets by autumn," Eleanor replied after checking her records. "But only if we can get more wool from the Henderson ranch." The Henderson family had returned to their original homestead after Morrison's arrest, their land restored through the federal investigation of his crimes. Like many of Morrison's victims, they had emerged from the ordeal with a new appreciation for neighbors who had supported them during their darkest hours. Dr. Harrison arrived for his weekly medical consultation, a routine that had evolved from Eleanor's recovery into a regular exchange of healing knowledge. His collaboration with Apache healers had revolutionized medical care throughout the territory, combining traditional European techniques with indigenous plant medicine to create treatments more effective than either approach alone. "How is the new clinic progressing?" Eleanor asked as he examined a selection of dried herbs that Grandmother Spider had prepared. "Construction should finish by midsummer," Harrison replied with satisfaction. "We'll be the first medical facility in the territory designed from the beginning to integrate both healing traditions." The clinic represented another breakthrough in the gradual integration of the two communities. Young Apache men were training as interpreters and medical assistants, while white apprentices learned to identify and prepare traditional plant medicine. The knowledge exchange benefited everyone, creating a medical system uniquely adapted to frontier conditions. Eleanor walked through her transformed property as evening approached, noting how the boundaries between Apache and white architecture had blurred in the ongoing improvement. Her cabin now incorporated design elements from both traditions, creating a style that was purely functional yet beautiful in its harmony with the surrounding landscape. Standing Thunder emerged from the forest with a small group of young warriors, their monthly visit timed to coincide with the full moon and the tribal council meetings that addressed regional concerns. Eleanor had become an unofficial member of that council, her voice carrying weight in decisions that affected relationships with territorial authorities. "Eleanor, who helps?" Standing Thunder greeted her with the formal title that had become her name among the Apache people. "The young men wish to thank you for arranging their work with the railroad survey crew." Eleanor smiled at the group of warriors who had traded their traditional weapons for surveying tools, earning wages that supported their families while learning skills that would serve their communities for generations. The railroad would eventually cross Apache lands, but now it would do so as partners rather than invaders. As night settled over the valley, Eleanor sat on her porch, watching fireflies dance among the garden plants that represented the marriage of two agricultural traditions. Her tin cup held tea brewed from Apache herbs, sweetened with honey from hives that European bees had established in Apache territory. The loneliness that had nearly killed her seemed like a memory from someone else's life. Her homestead had become the heart of something unprecedented, a community where different peoples had learned to see their diversity as strength rather than threat. Thomas would have been proud, Eleanor thought, of how their simple dream of building a life in the wilderness had grown into something that would outlast them both.